Quick spoiler warning, this video contains content from the Invincible comics as well as Debbie's growth between seasons 1 through 4, so if you're not caught up, you've been warned. Everyone thinks Omni-Man created Invincible. His powers, the training, the Viltrumite bloodline. But that's not actually true. Because if Nolan had raised Mark alone, he probably becomes just like the alternate versions of him we see across the multiverse. Sinister Mark, Mohawk Mark, versions of Mark that fully embraced Viltrumite ideology because there was nothing strong enough emotionally to pull them away from it. And the terrifying part is, that's exactly what Nolan was trying to prevent himself from admitting. Because long before Mark ever got his powers, Debbie was already changing Nolan. For 20 years, she made one of the strongest Viltrumites alive live like a human being. A husband, a father, a person. And by the time Mark finally got his powers at 17, it was already too late for Nolan to fully erase that humanity. That's why Invincible is secretly not just the story of Mark becoming a hero. It's the story of Debbie breaking thousands of years of Viltrumite conditioning without ever throwing a punch. And the show makes this infinitely more powerful than the comics ever did. This is the most important part of the entire story. People think Mark was the first thing that changed Nolan. He wasn't. Debbie was. Because Nolan was sent to Earth to prepare it for Viltrumite takeover. That was the mission. And instead, he stays for 20 years. That alone is insane. A normal Viltrumite would have conquered the planet and remained completely emotionally detached from humanity. But Nolan delays the mission for decades. Why? Because Debbie slowly makes him human. Not physically, emotionally. She gives him routine, connection, family, vulnerability. Things Viltrumite culture suppresses entirely. And the proof is Mark himself. Because Nolan absolutely could have raised Mark as a pure Viltrumite from birth. He could have isolated him, conditioned him early, raised him to see humans as inferior before empathy ever developed. But he doesn't. Mark grows up normal. He goes to school, makes friends, gets embarrassed, feels awkward, cares about people. That's Debbie's influence. And subconsciously, Nolan allows it. Because after 20 years with Debbie, even Nolan himself starts emotionally drifting away from Viltrum's ideology. And that's what separates Mark from so many of his alternate versions. When you look at versions like Sinister Mark, or Mohawk Mark, they feel like what happens when Viltrum's ideology wins completely. Power without empathy, strength without humanity. Those versions of Mark still have Nolan's blood, his abilities, his Viltrumite power. But they don't feel emotionally grounded in the same way the main Mark does. Because the difference was never just powers or training. It was the human life Debbie built around him before Nolan could fully turn him into something else. That's why the reveal scene works so well. Because Nolan isn't just fighting Mark physically, he's fighting 20 years of humanity Debbie forced him to experience. This is the core of the entire video. Debbie teaches Mark the opposite of everything Viltrumites believe. Viltrumites value determination. Debbie values empathy. Viltrumites see attachment as weakness. Debbie sees connection. Viltrumites believe power determines worth. Debbie teaches Mark that people matter regardless of strength. And that becomes the defining difference between Mark and every other major Viltrumite in the story. Conquest, Thrag, even Nolan for most of his life. They all believe compassion eventually becomes expendable. Mark never fully accepts that, because Debbie rooted his morality before Nolan could fully indoctrinate him. That's why Mark constantly hesitates to kill, why civilian deaths destroy him emotionally, why guilt affects him so deeply, and why he keeps protecting people even when it's strategically irrational. Those aren't Viltrumite traits. Those are Debbie's values surviving inside someone with godlike power. And that's why the alternate Marks matter. Because they show what Mark could have become without that emotional foundation. Sinister Mark, Mohawk Mark, versions of Mark that leaned fully into domination, superiority, and violence. They're basically proof that Viltrumite power alone doesn't create a hero. Debbie does. And ironically, those same values eventually influence Nolan too, because by the end of the story, Nolan himself becomes proof Debbie succeeded. Not instantly, definitely not perfectly, but permanently. Thank you guys so much for watching, and if you enjoyed, please like, comment, and subscribe, and suggest new characters you want to see in future videos. Peace.